All right, good afternoon, everyone. Well, almost afternoon. Welcome to our presentation today. I want to welcome you on behalf of the University of Florida IFAS Extension Polk County. And I want to thank Haines City Water Utilities as well for partnering with us to offer this lunch and learn. Today, we're going to talk about steps to a Florida-friendly landscape. I'm Julie Shelb. I'm the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program Coordinator with the University of Florida IFAS Extension Polk County. And so today, like I said, we're going to talk about steps to a Florida Friendly landscape and how we can be better gardeners and utilize Florida Friendly landscaping in our own yards. So today, we're going to talk about, well, what does that mean? What is Florida Friendly landscaping? We'll look at some of the importance of Florida-friendly landscaping in regards to the environment, and also a legislative definition that we have here in Florida. Then we're going to go into the principles of Florida-friendly landscaping, and those are going to be our steps. And then we have a few examples of some Florida-friendly yards for you to look at today. So what is Florida-friendly landscaping? Well, it's a science-based educational program, a way that we can maintain our landscapes here in Florida. You know, Florida has a very unique climate. If you've lived anywhere else, particularly in the United States, Florida's climate's very different. How we garden, how we landscape is very different as well. And so by following Florida-friendly landscaping, we can have beautiful landscapes, but we can also maintain them in a way that protects our natural resources and reduces our use of water, fertilizer, and pesticides in the landscape. So, you know, why is Florida-friendly landscaping important? Well, we've got some environmental concerns to think about. First of all, the pollution associated with stormwater runoff here in Florida is a really huge problem. We have a rainy season in the summer. We have, you know, lots of rain. We have lots of development as well. We have lots of buildings and paved roads. And so all of that water runs off. Most of it doesn't stay on site. And so it ends up in other bodies of water. And the pollution, the things that it picks up along the way, are associated with that. And so in Florida, you know, sometimes we want to blame someone else for all the issues we have. You know, we have bodies of water that maybe have algae buildup. And we think, well, that's someone else's problem, right? Some big corporation, somebody else did that. But think about all the residents here in Florida. Think about all of the individual landscapes, the community landscapes that we have, and what we do to those landscapes, the amount of fertilizer we use, maybe some improper landscaping practices, and how that affects all of us. It doesn't just affect our own neighborhood. Often we live in, or not often, we do live in watersheds. And so all of our water is connected. And so one, what we do affects that quality of water, but two, the amount of water that we have is also important. So it's important to conserve that water. It turns out that 60% of our home water use is used outdoors in the landscape. So we're using a lot of water. And so by utilizing Florida-friendly landscaping principles, we can reduce the amount of water that we use in our landscapes. Florida-friendly landscaping does have a statute in the state legislature. And so it states that Florida-friendly landscapes are quality landscapes. They conserve water, they protect the environment, they're adaptable to local conditions, and they're drought tolerant. And so, you know, it's important. The state has recognized how important it is to conserve our natural resources and protect those, and how we maintain our landscapes here in Florida. The Florida-friendly landscaping is made up of 9 principles. And so you can see those listed here. And so we're going to go into detail into each of these principles, and these are going to be our steps for creating a Florida-friendly landscape. So the first step, the foundation of Florida-friendly landscaping is right plant, right place. So when we select plants that are suitable for our site conditions, those plants are going to be less susceptible to pests and disease, and they're going to be better able to thrive. So how do you consider right plant, right place? How do you choose right plant, right place? Well, there's a few things to consider. One, you want to think about our climate. You know, we talked about Florida is so different from the rest of the United States. Well, from north to south, Florida is also very different. So it's important to consider where you are. I believe most of us are here in Central Florida. Polk County particularly. And so we want to think about our hardiness zone. So here in Polk County, we are hardiness zone 9B. So what does that mean when I say 9B? Well, that means that on average, we could receive certain temperatures in the winter that might affect our plants. Those cold temperatures could get near freezing. And so it's important to select plants that can tolerate those temperatures. And we have lots of guides to help you select plants as well. Another thing to consider is what type of soil do you have? You know, do you have sandy soil? Maybe you live in a new development and you have a lot of maybe fill material brought in. Maybe your soil is very compacted as well. And so that's important to consider when installing new plants, or maybe why your plants might not be doing well. For right plant, right place, you might also want to consider what type of sunlight do you have or lack thereof. You know, again, if you're living in a newer community, potentially a lot of the shade trees have been removed. So you have a lot of full sun light available. So you want to choose plants that are going to thrive in those conditions. If you choose plants that are more suited for shade and you put them in full sun, they're going to show signs of something's wrong. Maybe they'll be yellow. They'll look chlorotic. You might think maybe they have a nutrient deficiency, but it's really just the plant's not in the right spot, so it's not able to thrive, and vice versa. You know, if we select plants that are for full sun and put them in the shade, they might not flower as well, and they may get kind of leggy. And so those plants just aren't thriving. Again, they might be more susceptible to pest and disease problems. And so that's another thing to consider. You know, why is this plant showing some type of symptoms? Why does it have potential pest problems? Well, think about what's going on with that plant. Some more things to consider with right plant, right place. Think about the mature size of plants. That's really important. Often we see plants that look beautiful and we think, oh, this would look really great here, whether it's in, you know, my yard, maybe in a median for a community, something like that. But have we thought about how large this plant actually gets? What type of maintenance does this require? You know, if we select the right plant for the right place and think about size, we may not have to, you know, prune too much to keep that plant in the spot we've chosen. Another thing to consider, that picture on the upper right, it might be hard to tell, but that has standing water. And so another thing to consider about your landscape is, does it dry fairly quickly? You know, when you have a rain event, how quickly does that water filter through on site? Or do you have areas of the landscape where that water stands, maybe for 24 hours, 48 hours, something like that? And so you want to consider what type of soil and how moist is that soil? Does it dry out? Does it tend to stay moist? We want to select plants that are suited for those site conditions as well. Next, we want to consider watering efficiently. So in our Florida-friendly landscape, how we irrigate our plants is really important. Again, we want to choose drought-tolerant plants when appropriate, but even when we can't, there's ways to help have a Florida-friendly landscape that conserves water and still maybe uses some supplemental irrigation. But before you do that, some things to consider. You know, track the rainfall. It's as simple as using a rain gauge. That's one way. The other thing to consider with tracking rain is if you have an automatic irrigation system, here in the state of Florida, by law, you are required to have an automatic rain shutoff device of some type. It could be this rain sensor as pictured in the upper right. It could be you have a soil moisture sensor. There's lots of newer technologies out there, but regardless, here in the state of Florida, if you have a sprinkler that turns on automatically and waters your lawn and your landscape, you should have some device that's tracking the moisture in the soil or the rain that falls and tells that system if we've had adequate rain that it won't run and won't waste water. Another simple thing you can do is install a rain barrel. Rain barrels are great. You can connect them. Maybe you have gutters and downspouts. But even if you don't, if you have a valley in your roof, you can still put a rain barrel there to collect rainwater. And that's a great way to water or irrigate plants, maybe newly installed plants that just need watering to establish. And that's something to consider. All plants have an establishment period. Even if we're choosing drought-tolerant plants, sometimes people confuse and think, well, if I just use all native plants, I won't need to water. And that may be the case. It just depends. Remember, Florida is very diverse. We have very dry areas in Florida, and we have naturally wet areas as well. So again, right plant, right place, choosing plants that will thrive on our site conditions. Some other things to consider with watering efficiently in your Florida-friendly landscape. You might consider installing micro irrigation. And so that picture on the left is a little micro sprayer. And so micro irrigation is a type of low volume irrigation. So this is irrigation that's 30 gallons per hour or less. And so additionally with micro irrigation, the water stays close to the plant's roots, and that's what ultimately needs water. Now you can't use micro irrigation in your lawn, but micro irrigation is great for your landscape beds, maybe some newly installed plants that you just need to temporarily irrigate until established. Maybe you have some potted plants on a patio or something. Micro irrigation is a great way to do that. Some other things to consider with watering efficiently. One, you want to regularly check your irrigation system, whether it's your micro irrigation or your high volume sprinklers. We want to make sure we're not watering sidewalks. We want to make sure we don't have broken sprayers, things like that that are wasting water. And so you can get out there, you can turn your system on in the middle of the day. You can turn it on for 10 minutes and check each zone. You have to be out there, but you can check it and see if you have, a broken head or something. Maybe you've noticed your water bill has gone up. Have you checked your irrigation lately? How often are you running it? We just had the time change, right? We just sprung forward. That's been interesting, right? And so something to consider with that is, have you checked your irrigation system? Have you checked the time on your clock? Are you watering at the right time? Because if you didn't change the time on your irrigation clock, you might be watering past 8 a.m. or something. And that could be a violation depending on your watering restrictions. So you want to check with your local water utility to find out when you're allowed to water, what times of day, and what days of the week as well. Another way to water efficiently is to calibrate your irrigation system. And so it's recommended that each time you irrigate, you apply 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch of irrigation to your lawn. Why do you have that range? Well, it depends. What type of turf grass do you have? What type of soil do you have? Do you need to just run it for the 1/2 inch? Do you need to run it for the full 3/4 of an inch? And so you can do that by performing what's called a catch can test. So you can set containers of a similar size out in one irrigation zone, turn your irrigation on for 10 minutes. After 10 minutes, get a ruler or a tape measure, go measure how much water is in each can. You want to add up all of those numbers and then divide by the number of containers, and that's going to give you the average amount. So after 10 minutes, let's say 1/4 of an inch was applied, you know that you need to run your irrigation system for 20 minutes in order to apply 1/2 an inch of water. The next step of a Florida-friendly landscape is fertilizing, and fertilizing appropriately. Oftentimes, again, we see something wrong with our plants, right? We think, okay, they're yellow, they're showing some type of symptom. Let's fertilize them. That'll fix everything. That's not necessarily the case. If your plants are already stressed and it's not a nutrient deficiency, you're just adding to that stress of that plant. Maybe we're experiencing, we're experiencing some type of drought. That's not a time to fertilize either. Maybe consider the time of the year. Again, here in Florida, while we do have pretty much beautiful weather year round, plants aren't actively growing year round. Most things do stay green, but we do have some deciduous plants. But during the winter, a lot of our plants are not actively growing. Certainly you can see that with the turf grass, right? In the summer, you have to mow pretty constantly, right? Just about every week almost, how fast the grass is growing. But in the winter, it's much less frequent. Maybe once a month, maybe you don't have to mow at all in the winter. That's just an indication that plants aren't actively growing and you don't need to fertilize. Another thing to consider is using the right fertilizer. Don't use your azalea bloom on your lawn. Vice versa, you want to use what's appropriate for those plants. Some other things to consider with fertilizing is, have you performed a soil pH test? Do you even know what your soil pH is? That might be an indication of why your plants are not thriving. And that could also tell you what type of fertilizer to use as well. So you can take a soil test. Yeah, some other things to consider, you want to watch the weather. you don't want to water within 24, or excuse me, we don't want to water, but you don't want to fertilize within 24 to 48 hours of a heavy rain event. If you put that fertilizer down and we have a summer storm here in Florida, you can pretty much guarantee that fertilizer is washing off site. You've wasted your money and your time fertilizing. So watch the weather, fertilize when it's appropriate. And then another thing to consider, there can be a lot of fertilizer products out there and it can be kind of confusing. The one product you want to be cautious with are those weed and feed products. You'll see a lot of commercials this time of year. It's spring, everyone's excited about getting back outside. You'll see the commercials for the weed and feed. We don't recommend you use those combination weed and feed products. And that is because it contains an herbicide, some type of herbicide, and it contains a fertilizer. Well, the time that you apply those is separate. Some of those are pre-emergence. You would have applied those back in February. Maybe you need to fertilize your lawn. You're going to do that in April. So the timing is off. The other important thing to consider with weed and feed products is that some of those herbicides that are contained in there can actually damage nearby trees and shrubs if they're applied and the roots are nearby where that fertilizer was applied and they take it up. You can actually see burnout on your shrubs and trees. So again, if you do have weeds in your lawn, spot treat those weeds. Correctly identify what weeds you have, find out what products are actually effective at controlling those, and do that. Then purchase your fertilizer if you need to fertilize and broadcast that separately. Another step to Florida-friendly landscaping is using mulch in the landscape. And so mulch is very beneficial. It helps retain soil moisture. It helps prevent weeds from growing. And it can also reduce erosion, over like a sandy area or something. However, there's some right ways to utilize mulch and some maybe not best ways to utilize mulch. Step one, you want to apply a 2 to 3 inch layer of mulch. The other step is that you want to make sure it's some type of organic wood-based mulch. And when I say organic, I mean that it contains carbon, that it breaks down, not organic as in certified organic. That's separate. So what are some mulches that you could utilize that are Florida friendly? Well, pine straw is a great mulch, pine bark. Melaleuca is an invasive tree down in South Florida. And so by utilizing that mulch, you're helping remove that invasive tree and it's perfectly safe in your landscape. Melaleuca mulch also tends to mat together. So maybe you have an area where you experience some type of washout. That might be a good choice for you. Eucalyptus is another good Florida-friendly mulch. You could use fallen leaves. You could also use tree trimmings. Those are perfectly fine to use. Just use caution as you don't always know what was trimmed and what might be contained in those tree trimmings. Some mulches that we wouldn't recommend around your plants would be like crushed gravel, rock, things like that. Those are great as pathways because they're permeable. We'll talk about they let water through. However, when surrounding your plants, they don't support the health of your plants or the soil. They could create some microclimate that could heat up the soil. It could damage microbes and other organisms in the soil, and it could create a hotter microclimate around your plants. Another mulch that we wouldn't recommend using at all is cypress mulch. Cypress is pretty popular, however, it's not a sustainable source. The rate at which cypress trees grow and the rate at which they're harvested isn't sustainable. And even if you were getting mulch that was harvested from a place that was growing the trees just for that, it's hard to know on the bag, or if you're buying in bulk, where was this mulch harvested from? So that's why it's better to just leave cypress mulch alone. If you are a fan of cypress mulch, you might utilize eucalyptus mulch in the landscape. And so as you can see in that upper left picture, again, we recommend a 2 to 3 inch layer. That's sufficient. You can see in that picture, that's way too much mulch. Mulch is beneficial in that it retains soil moisture, but when we pack it against the tree trunk, it's going to hold moisture against that trunk, and that's not beneficial or helpful for that tree. That can actually cause that tree to decline. That's also inhibiting the roots in the soil and the oxygen exchange that occurs by that mulch being too thick. Another key when you're applying mulch is you want to keep it pulled away from your plants, from your trees, at least 12 to 18 inches away from the trunk. From your shrubs, 3 to 4 inches, and just a few inches away from your flowering perennials and things like that. But again, there's lots of mulch options. And so we want to just make sure that we maximize their use and their potential in the landscape. Another step of your Florida-friendly landscape is attracting wildlife. Right now, there's a lot of buzz, if you will, about pollinators and protecting them. And so a Florida-friendly landscape also provides habitat and protects pollinators as well, along with other wildlife. You can easily create a butterfly garden by utilizing both host and nectar plants for butterflies. And so when I say host plants, I'm talking about plants that the caterpillars feed on. Sometimes we don't know that what an insect is, and it might be the caterpillar for a beautiful butterfly. We might have that host plant in our yard, and so that caterpillar is going to chew up that plant. But host plants were created that they can sustain the damage from those caterpillars. It'll be okay for those plants. Again, flowering plants are going to provide nectar for butterflies, bees, other pollinators. So in addition to providing, flowers and plants, you want to consider providing a water source if you can, a bird bath, maybe a butterfly puddling station. And we can provide more information on that if you're interested. The other thing with attracting wildlife is the design of your landscape. And so you want to create what's called different layers in your landscape. So you have ground covers that protect wildlife that stays on the ground. Then maybe you have shrubs for that intermediate layer of wildlife that provides protection. And then we have trees as well that provide habitat and shelter for different animals. And so those are just a few ways that you can provide for wildlife in your landscape. Another step is managing landscape pests responsibly. Oftentimes, especially this time of year, your plants are starting to bud out now. They're starting to leaf out potentially. Some new growth is happening. A lot of that new growth is very tender. A lot of insects enjoy eating that new growth. It's very soft. There's a lot out right now. There's a lot of new insects that maybe potentially have hatched as well. And so it's important to scout your landscape regularly. You may not think you're scouting, but just taking a walk outside, whether it's your landscape, something in the community, just keeping an eye on it. Just see, what's happening. Have you noticed something different? Look on the underside of leaves as well. If you're seeing damage, some of these insects are very smart and they live on the underside of the leaf. So they can be hard to find, but just look around, but also correctly identify. There's lots of beneficial insects out there as well that are helping to combat the pest insects in your landscape. Pictured here are all insects that are beneficial in your landscape. There's the green lynx spider. It pretty much eats anything, but it does eat harmful insects. There's the green lacewing at the bottom. That's another beneficial insect. And then in the top right, I think everyone's familiar with ladybugs, also known as lady beetles. We know they're great beneficial bugs in our landscape, but many people don't realize that many of these insects go through metamorphosis, just like a butterfly does, right? A butterfly starts out as an egg, and then it transforms to a caterpillar, and then it goes into a chrysalis, and then it comes out as a beautiful butterfly. Ladybugs have a very similar transformation. They start out as an egg, and then they turn into this little stage here on the right. Not every ladybug looks like that on the right. Their young stage might look a little bit different, but if you see those in your landscape, just think about that. They're eating a lot. They're very beneficial as well. So just like the adults are eating, so are those younger stages. And so learning to identify what these different stages of insects look like is very important for maintaining a healthy landscape and managing pests in your landscape. Another step of Florida-friendly landscaping is recycling your yard waste. And it can be very easy, or you can be a little more proactive about it. When you mow the lawn, just leaving the grass clippings on the lawn is one way to recycle that yard waste. As those grass clippings break down, they provide nutrients in the soil that ultimately gets taken up. Same thing with your trees that lose their leaves. Oak trees shed some of their leaves. They're not deciduous, but they do shed leaves. Pine trees shed their leaves. And so instead of raking those up, consider creating what we would call a self-mulching area. So you would let the leaves just stay there and they would create a mulch around those trees. That's a little less work. You don't have to rake those up now. You can compost as well. That's another way to recycle yard waste. You can keep your yard clippings on site and compost them. That's another way. Now, reducing stormwater runoff is pretty important for a Florida-friendly landscape. Like I mentioned earlier, the pollution associated with stormwater runoff is really a big deal here in Florida. Like I said, we have our summer rains. And so there's a lot of rain associated with that. There's a lot of roofs and impermeable surfaces. So when I say impermeable surfaces, I mean surfaces where the water has to run over. The water can't filter through that. It has to run off until it finds another point. Maybe that's a yard. Maybe that's a landscape. Maybe that's some body of water. And so think about all the things that rainwater picks up. Now, this also could be associated with excess irrigation. Maybe you're overwatering. You're watering to the point that your irrigation is running down your driveway and it's running down the street. That's also a point where pollution can be associated with that excess rainwater that goes down, or that excess irrigation water that might end up in a stormwater pond or some other natural body of water. And so we want to reduce that. So there's some things that you can consider. One, increasing the amount of permeable surfaces. Again, those are areas where water filters on site. Again, having permeable pathways, so or a driveway. So instead of your sidewalk or your driveway made of concrete, consider some other materials. Like I mentioned, that rock and shell are not great around your plants, but those are good materials for your driveway, for your pathways, for your sidewalks. Consider directing your downspouts into your lawn and landscape areas. That way they stay on site. Don't direct your downspout into your driveway so that it just goes down the road. Again, we want to keep that water on site, let it filter through on site. Again, rain barrels we talked about earlier are great for watering efficiently, but they're also great for catching that stormwater that we can then use on site, and it's not wasted or running off site. Here in Florida, we have so much excess stormwater that you can use rain barrels. One thing to consider though with rain barrels, if you do live in an HOA, you just want to follow, check your codes or any restrictions that you might have for where you can place it potentially. Another thing is, if you're sweeping up maybe grass clippings or leaves that have fallen, don't brush those into the driveway or into the road. Certainly do not put those down the storm drain either. Just collect those back on site. Either recycle them in a compost pile or put them in a landscape bed or put them for yard trash, but don't push those out into the street because, again, like I said, keeping those grass clippings in your lawn, they have excess nutrients that can be released into the soil, but if they go into that body of water, they're going to release those excess nutrients into that body of water. Again, in the upper left, you can see a rain garden. And so rain gardens are great. If you have an area where you need to direct some stormwater runoff, maybe from your roof, you can create a shallow swale, a depressed area that collects the water. Now the water, this is not a pond. This water should drain within 24 to 48 hours, but it utilizes plants that can handle that influx of water, but that can also tolerate the periods of drought where they don't have that excess rain. And so rain gardens can be really beautiful, but they can also be really beneficial. And then finally, with Florida-friendly landscaping, we want to protect the waterfront. Certainly, we know Florida is a peninsula. We're surrounded on 3 sides by water, ultimately, but we have so many natural bodies of water as well as man-made bodies of water with stormwater ponds. And so we want to protect those. Some ways that we can protect those are utilizing native shoreline plantings. Those are going to help, one, reduce erosion. Many times people they don't want anything. They think, I just want a clear shoreline. Well, over time, if you don't have any plant material on that shoreline, it's going to erode, and that stormwater pond is going to get larger and larger into your backyard. But also keeping those native plants along the shore are also going to help filter any pollutants that may run off from your yard. Maybe if the road washes back into your yard, down into that body of water. So native plantings. And then also we would encourage you to create a 10-foot maintenance-free zone. So within this 10 feet from the shoreline of the body of water into your yard, no mowing, no fertilizing, and no use of any pesticides that are not appropriate near bodies of water. That way, again, you're reducing the amount of nutrients or excess nutrients that might end up in that body of water. So you're keeping that body of water cleaner and it's healthier. So if you're considering changing some of your landscape, maybe it's not as Florida friendly, you've been doing some practices that aren't as environmentally friendly as you thought, there are some steps that you can take. Develop a plan, think this through. Take some time, decide what you would really enjoy in your landscape. What would be most beneficial for you, for your neighborhood, things like that. And then of course, follow the 9 principles of Florida friendly landscaping, which we've just talked about. Think about, what you enjoy. Do you need an area of lawn for recreation? Do you need a place to play, to let your dog run around? Florida friendly landscaping is not anti-turf grass. It would just say utilize turf grass as necessary, functional turf grass, if you will. So maybe you just need a smaller area of turf grass in your landscape that you can use. Maybe you don't need any at all. Maybe you can utilize ground covers, other shrubs and plants like that in your landscape. And then come up with a list of plants that work for your site. Think about how much sun or shade you have. Think about your soil. Consider getting your pH tested. Excuse me. Things like that. And then I would strongly encourage that you install in phases. Making changes in the landscape can be very time consuming and could cost some money, but in the long run, it'll be very beneficial to you. But I think it's important to start small. Do one area, do one landscape bed. Maybe take away just a little bit of turf grass and expand that landscape bed out front. See how that goes. Did you enjoy what you put in? Maybe you've done enough research, but even after you put some of those plants in, you decided, no, that's not really what I wanted. That way you haven't done the entire landscape and you have time to make a few changes before you do other areas of the landscape. And of course, if you're doing any changes in your landscape and you live in an HOA, you want to consider, are there any rules or restrictions? Do you need to submit any plans to a committee to have those reviewed? All right, and so now we'll just look at a few examples of some Florida-friendly landscapes. And so you can see here on the left is what we would consider maybe traditional, right? There's a home and there's lots of turf grass. But on the right, what have they done? It's a little more Florida friendly. There's a little less turf grass. It's not no turf grass, just a little less. More landscape beds, more plants that are maybe drought tolerant, that don't need that excess irrigation, or maybe they can survive on micro irrigation versus that high volume irrigation. Here's another example. Here's a traditional landscape. Okay, they have a few shrubs out front, but then look at the picture on the right. A lot more shrubs, right? A lot less turf grass. And then here are some full yard conversions. So here's a before, again, very traditional with just a lot of turf grass. Turf grass can be very cheap to install, but it can be expensive in the long run, depending on how you maintain that. Again, if you don't need that turf grass, consider converting some of it to landscape beds that can thrive on little to no irrigation. And so here's the after. So they've completely removed that turf grass. They put in flowering perennials, some small shrubs, a tree, and they're utilizing mulch to fill in those areas to keep weeds at bay. Now, I'm not saying, another thing to consider is a Florida-friendly landscape is not no maintenance. It just could be considered lower maintenance depending on what you install. I'm not saying there will never be weeds in this landscape. There will be weeds, but they've got the mulch, they've got the other plants to help fill in the spaces. They're providing for wildlife. And a lot of those plants are probably very drought tolerant and won't need supplemental irrigation. Here's a final example for you. Here's a front yard again. So they have, they're starting to remove that turf grass. So step one was killing the turf grass so that they could remove it and then install this new landscape. So again, here's a situation where they didn't need turf grass in the front yard. So just consider, do you need this area? What's the most appropriate or right plant for this area? So they've removed the turf grass. They've installed beach sunflower, a low-growing, very drought-tolerant ground cover. They've got some other shrubs in the landscape. They've got pathways, though. You know, certainly you don't want to be walking through shrubs and stuff, but it's a maintained landscape that has easy access as well, and it functions well for them. So there's lots of options. You don't have to convert your whole landscape. It can just be changing a few practices in how you maintain your landscape, and maybe even just how you irrigate. Being more conscious of when you're watering. Do you actually need to irrigate? You know, you can water less in the winter than maybe in the spring and fall. And certainly with our summer rains, you may not need to water at all. So today we looked at, you know, what is a Florida-friendly landscape? How is it important considering environmental and legislative aspects of Florida-friendly? We looked into depth at the steps or the 9 principles of Florida-friendly landscaping. We looked at a few examples. I've got a list of resources for you. The Florida-friendly landscaping program has a great plant selection guide. There's another guide or a handbook that goes through the 9 principles of Florida-friendly landscaping. We've got a great handout on adopting a Florida-friendly landscape. It looks at some of those traditional landscapes versus maybe some more Florida-friendly. There's a great pattern book as well to help you design your landscape. We've got a list of plants just for Polk County. It's not all inclusive, but it's a good short list to get you started. And then some other information on Florida-friendly landscaping. I do want to mention, if you're a resident of Polk County, we have the Polk Regional Water Cooperative, and within that we have the conservation team that is made up of our local water utilities. These water utilities offer different rebates or incentives to help you conserve water. There's some outdoor incentives and there's also some indoor incentives. So what I would encourage you to visit savepolkwater.org if you're a resident of Polk County to find your local water utility to find out what rebates might be available to you and if you qualify. I want to thank you all so much for joining us today. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. You can call us, email us, visit our website, follow us on social media at Polk Gardening.